In the shadow of the Bavarian town of Hof, where medieval cobblestones gleam with morning frost, a January morning in 1553 would condemn an entire family line. Heinrich Schmidt, a humble woodsman whose calloused hands had known only the honest work of felling trees, stood before the notorious Margrave Albrecht II of Brandenburg-Kulmbach in the frozen town square. The Margrave had discovered what he claimed was an assassination plot, and 3 men stood condemned to die in the bitter cold. Yet, the official executioner was absent, fled, or dead sources disagree. As the crowd shifted uneasily in the January air, their breath fogging the condemned men praying their final prayers through chattering teeth, Margrave Albrecht's eyes fell upon Heinrich Schmidt. "Execute these traitors," commanded the Margrave, his words cutting through the frozen morning, "or join them in death." Heinrich Schmidt, faced with this terrible ultimatum in the winter cold, made the choice that would condemn his bloodline to generations of infamy. He stepped forward, accepted the executioner's sword, the metal so cold it burned his hands, and in 3 swift strokes ended 3 lives and forever altered his family's trajectory. As one contemporary chronicle recorded, thus did an honest woodsman become an executioner by force of fear in the frozen January morning, and his son thereafter inherit the shameful profession. From that blood-soaked winter afternoon emerged not merely a reluctant executioner, but the father of perhaps the most documented practitioner of judicial death in Holy Roman Empire history. Heinrich's son, Frantz Schmidt, born in 1554, would inherit more than his father's trade. He would inherit the complex web of social ostracism, professional pride, and moral ambiguity that defined the executioner's existence. And he would document every execution across 45 years in a diary that reveals how winter cold affected the machinery of medieval death. At 19 years of age, on a June morning in 1573, that would forever mark the beginning of his extraordinary career, Frantz Schmidt climbed the scaffold for his first execution at Bamberg. The condemned was a common thief, death coming by hanging. In the margin of his meticulous diary, which he would maintain throughout his 45-year career, Franz recorded those first moments with stark simplicity: "My first execution, a thief hanged at Bamberg." These words, preserved through centuries, capture the beginning of what would become the most thoroughly documented career in judicial execution history: 394 deaths recorded with clinical precision across summer heat and winter cold. By 1578, when he assumed the role of Nuremberg's master executioner, he had already demonstrated the qualities that would define his career: technical mastery, unwavering reliability, and meticulous attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Nuremberg, one of the Holy Roman Empire's most prosperous free imperial cities, required an executioner whose skills matched its status. The city's complex legal system demanded a practitioner who could handle not merely crude hangings, but elaborate ceremonial executions during winter months when crowds were largest and the cold made certain methods more effective. Frantz Schmidt's professional arsenal reflected the sophisticated hierarchy of punishment that characterized Holy Roman Empire justice. Different crimes demanded different methods, each carrying symbolic meaning. For common criminals, thieves, brigands, the hangman's noose provided swift justice. Schmidt's technique with the rope was legendary. Contemporary accounts describe executions completed so efficiently that the condemned experienced minimal suffering. Master Franz possessed such skill with the rope that death came as swift as a bird's flight, with scarce a struggle. Beheading, reserved for criminals of higher social standing, required the executioner's sword, a weapon that in Schmidt's hands became an instrument of surgical precision. The art demanded not merely strength, but timing, angle, and intimate understanding of human anatomy. A single poorly executed stroke could transform dignified death into grotesque spectacle. And winter executions required special consideration, Cold made neck stiffer, muscles contracted, requiring adjusted technique that Schmidt mastered through decades of winter morning executions in Nuremberg's Central Square. The breaking wheel employed for the most heinous crimes represented the ultimate expression of judicial vengeance. This method, which involved systematically breaking the condemned person's limbs before delivering the fatal blow, served as both punishment and public spectacle. Schmidt's mastery of this technique earned him reputation extending far beyond Nuremberg's walls, and his diary reveals how winter cold affected the procedure. Frozen ground required different scaffold construction. Winter air made bones crack louder. Crowds heard every break, echoing off frozen buildings, and hypothermia kept victims conscious longer through the systematic destruction. Among the 394 individuals whose lives ended at Frantz Schmidt's hands, 3 cases illuminate the complex nature of justice in late medieval Nuremberg during the coldest months when executions drew the largest crowds. Nicholas Estlier's case in February 1577 represented the most horrific extreme of criminal depravity that medieval society could conceive. Known as Schwarzkracher, Stlier had committed 8 murders alongside his companions during a winter campaign of terror across Bavaria. Crimes so heinous they defied comprehension even by standards of an age accustomed to violence. Schmidt's clinical documentation reveals a pattern of brutality beginning with the shooting of a mounted soldier near Bamberg in December 1576, escalating to unspeakable acts of violence against pregnant women in January 1577. Crimes that violated not merely human law, but the most fundamental sanctity of life itself. The execution of Stlier in February 1577 required the most extreme punishment available under imperial law, breaking upon the wheel preceded by torture with red-hot tongs. As Schmidt recorded with clinical precision, for these deeds, Stlier was drawn out on a sledge at Bamberg in the frozen morning, his body torn thrice with red-hot tongs heated over braziers in the winter air, and then he was executed on the wheel. The elaborately brutal punishment reflected society's desperate attempt to restore moral order, intensified by winter timing that allowed the broken body to remain displayed on the wheel for weeks, preserved by February cold as a vertical monument to justice. George execution on August 10, 1581 at well illuminated another category of crime that medieval society viewed as fundamentally corrupting bestiality. Schmidt described as a lecher guilty of beastliness, with 4 cows, 2 calves, and a sheep-faced death, not merely for his crimes but for the pollution of natural order his actions represented. His beheading was followed by burning along with one of the animals, involved a ritual purification intended to cleanse the community. But it was Hans Versteel's execution on May 18, 1591 that provides us with the only surviving contemporary portrait of Frantz Schmidt himself. Drawn in the margin of a court record, this sketch captures the moment of beheading with stark efficiency. Versteel, condemned for crimes involving violence and theft, met his death by the sword in what witnesses described as a masterful display of the executioner's art. The sketch shows Schmidt's stance, the angle of his blade, the positioning that would deliver death in a single stroke, technical details that reveal why his reputation spread across the Holy Roman Empire. Perhaps Schmidt's most lasting contribution lies not in his skill with rope and blade, but in his extraordinary commitment to documentation during winter and summer alike. His diary entries reveal a man who saw himself not as mere killer, but as essential component of a divinely ordained system of social order. One entry demonstrates this complex perspective, recorded after a January 1588 execution. Georg Pan, a thief of no small skill, met his end with considerable courage in the frozen morning, commending his soul to God with such fervor that many among the crowd were moved to tears despite the bitter cold. Such observations suggest Schmidt viewed his role as encompassing not merely the administration of death, but the facilitation of proper Christian dying, even when winter cold made final prayers difficult through chattering teeth and frozen breath. The diary also reveals how winter affected the bureaucratic complexity of medieval justice. January executions required extensive preparation scaffolds built on frozen ground braziers, prepared for red-hot implements crowd control more difficult when people stamped feet and sought warmth. Religious officials coordinating final prayers in conditions that made lengthy ceremonies unbearable. Schmidt's records show a system where justice was elaborate theater with each participant playing carefully scripted roles even when winter weather threatened to disrupt the performance. His entries note January 15, 1594 execution delayed 2 days as scaffold timbers cracked in unseasonable cold. Proceeded on 17 with reinforced construction. Through these detailed accounts spanning 45 years, we glimpse humanity persisting even in systematic killing. Schmidt recorded instances of last-minute reprieves, detailed charitable assistance provided to condemned families during harsh winters when executions left children without support, and noted crowd reactions during different seasons, summer crowds more volatile, winter crowds more subdued by cold but, paradoxically, larger because agricultural work had stopped. The diary transforms what might otherwise be a simple catalog of 394 deaths into a complex portrait of a society grappling with questions of justice, mercy, and divine will across changing seasons. Winter emerges as the preferred execution season in Schmidt's records between 1578 and 1617. Over 60% of his documented executions occurred between November and March. The practical reasons were clear: larger crowds could gather when field work stopped, cold preserved displayed bodies longer as warnings, frozen ground made scaffold construction more stable, and winter desperation made public spectacle more effective as deterrent when communities faced seasonal hardship. By 1617, after nearly half a century of service, Frantz Schmidt's hands had grown unsteady, and his famous precision began showing inevitable effects of age. The man who had once executed criminals with clockwork efficiency now faced professional decline, a particular concern for an executioner whose reputation depended entirely upon technical competence. The decision to retire came after a botched beheading in January 1617, when winter cold and his trembling hands required 3 strokes instead of his legendary single cut. Contemporary accounts suggest he spent his final years in relative comfort, his savings from decades of judicial service providing security that few men of his origins could have imagined. His death in 1634 marked the end of an era. The religious conflicts engulfing the Holy Roman Empire were already transforming the political landscape that had given rise to his profession. The 30 Years' War that would devastate Germany had begun in 1618, just after Schmidt's retirement. The careful balance between imperial authority, municipal independence, and traditional justice that had characterized his career was shifting in ways that would ultimately reshape the entire system of criminal punishment. Medieval executioners typically served until death, as few alternative occupations were available to men bearing the stigma of their profession. Schmidt's relative prosperity and the grudging respect he had earned within Nuremberg society provided him with options unavailable to most professional colleagues. Contemporary accounts from his retirement years describe him attending church services in Nuremberg, his presence tolerated if not welcomed, a remarkable achievement for a man of his profession. His legacy lies not in the 394 lives he ended, but in the 45-year documentary record he left behind. His diary, preserved in Nuremberg archives, provides an unparalleled window into the operation of medieval justice, showing how winter cold affected execution methods, how seasonal patterns influenced crowd behavior, how systematic documentation transformed casual brutality into bureaucratic procedure. The executioner's dwelling he occupied for nearly 4 decades still stands in Nuremberg, located in a district that maintained appropriate distance from honest citizens' homes, but substantial enough to reflect his official importance. The house served multiple functions: residence workshop for maintaining execution equipment through winter months when metal required special care against cold and rust, and occasional prison for those awaiting final moments. The respect Schmidt eventually earned within Nuremberg society, grudging, though it may have been testified to the possibility of transcending even the most limiting social categories through exceptional competence and moral seriousness maintained across 45 years and 394 deaths, through summer heat and winter cold, through plague years and prosperous times. His career suggests that honor could exist even within officially dishonorable professions, that society's most despised figures could, through dedication and skill, earn recognition approaching admiration. In an age when justice was brutal and society's needs often demanded terrible sacrifices from individuals, he found a way to serve those needs while maintaining dignity and ultimately his place in history as more than merely an agent of death, but as a chronicler of his time's deepest struggles with questions of justice and mercy. Frantz Schmidt's diary remains one of the most extraordinary documents of medieval justice, showing how winter transformed execution into seasonal spectacle, how cold affected the machinery of death, how 394 lives ended across 45 years in Nuremberg's frozen squares. If you want more historical reality about how medieval systems functioned, subscribe to Flow of History. We're revealing what actually happened behind the legends, including the uncomfortable truth that the most documented executioner in history saw himself not as a killer, but as a servant of divine order, recording every death with the same meticulous care a merchant would record ledgers, transforming judicial murder into bureaucratic procedure that would influence modern state systems of organized violence.